Hi everyone, my name is Purvi Makwana. I'm a consultant with Opalwave and I've been involved in a few of these IFRS 16 implementations. So this session is titled IFRS 16 Initial Data Load, and we're going to go through the process of the initial mass upload of existing transitional leases into the IFRS 16 model. We'll also discuss some of the data requirements and go through how to use the bulk upload template to input these leases into VPC. During the upload process, I'll discuss a few potential errors and how you can avoid these as well. Okay, so in the previous session, we went through how we can create a lease using all of the different IFRS 16 templates. However, when you're going through loading hundreds or thousands of leases at once, that's going to be very time consuming. So we've got this template here, IFI 000, data preparation and bulk loading. And this is going to be used for the initial mass upload. So we do recommend that you don't try and load more than 150 leases at a time, so load them in batches. Otherwise, the process will be very slow and oftentimes it will just crash and not work properly. Okay, so the first thing to do is to ensure that all of the data is ready and complete. There aren't any missing values or missing payments or anything. And then this source data sheet needs to be filled in. The menu explains all of the different steps if you do need to go over that. Yeah, so we begin by filling out this data preparation source data sheet, and the compulsory things that need to be filled in are in this white section here from columns BG to BV. The rest of these are optional. Okay, so here we can just put in a description for our leases. So I've created some in advance for this, so vehicle 1 and vehicle 2. And then I've put in the start dates and the end dates. One thing to remember is that the dates are inclusive. So this is the final day. If I made it the 1st of May, that would extend the lease by 1 extra period. So the thing to remember with transitional leases is that the start date is the first payment date after transition. So with this lease, it initiated on the 1st of May 2018, and because it's a quarterly lease, the first payment that occurs after the transition date, which in our case is the 1st of January 2019, would be the 1st of February 2019. So this is our lease start date. The day in the start date is the day in which the payment occurs, so that's the same month as the first payment month. And the year is obviously the transition year. For partially retrospective A leases, we also enter the lease inception date here in this green column, but this doesn't need to be done for partially retrospective B leases. Okay, and then here we can enter the payment frequency for the leases as well. And these are just the asset type, the lease currency, and the entity. So one thing to note on the lease currency is that all lease currencies are prefixed with L_. So there have been issues where just the currency GBP or EUR might have been entered, but this won't be read into the IFRS 16 model. So it's important to make sure all lease currencies in this column are prefixed with L_. And another thing to mention is that all of these asset types and entity IDs and such have to match what's in the IFRS 16 model in VPC. A few other points to mention are that the lease reference description cannot exceed 60 characters. This is just a limit of NetWeaver. There are properties further down that are customer specific, and you can add further details to help you remember what a lease is about if you want to be more descriptive. There is also this variable payments option here, where in the event that your lease has variable payments, you can enter it in this tab here. So when you select that a lease has variable payments, the corresponding row will be highlighted in this orange color. and it gives you the option to input payments against all the months that they occur. So our lease begins in May 2018, so that's when the first payment is, and as you can see the payments are all variable here, so it changes from period to period. And the system occurs that payments will occur on the first month of the payment period. So if I input payments here, for example, in June or in July, the system won't pick these up because it sees this as a quarterly lease. In the case that the payments were taking place here, we would have to load this as a monthly lease and just miss out the periods in which payments are not occurring. So this would be a situation where leases don't fit a monthly, quarterly or yearly model. So they also need to be inputted manually. For example, if you had a lease where payments were occurring every other month, so May, July, and so on, then you'd have to load it as a quarterly lease with variable payments. A final point to note on days is that if a partially retrospective A transition method is being used, then the system will assume that the lease periods before transition are the same as those after transition. And if this isn't the case, then the payments have to be entered manually. So, for example, if a quarterly lease starts in October of 2014, the system expects all future lease periods to be in January, April, July, and October, and so on. So payments falling outside this pattern won't be picked up. Similarly, if a lease that's yearly begins in February of 2018 but has a future period in March of 2020, then this won't be picked up, and this needs to be entered as a monthly lease as well, because the system doesn't expect payments to fall outside of February of each year. So you're going back to the source data sheet. So one thing to mention as well while we're here is that you shouldn't delete any rows in anywhere on this template, because there are a lot of cell references and page references, so deleting any worksheets or rows will mess up all of these references and cause issues with data saving later on. Something else worth noting is that however many leases get entered here, you need to make sure that the number of rows in all of these subsequent coloured tabs are the same. So you can see here it ends on row 41, but if you were entering 150 leases, you'd need to just expand this down and drag the formulas down with it. Another instance where you might need to manipulate this template is if the customer has partially retrospective A leases that begin before the template starts. So here we can see it starts 93. If the customer's leases begin before then you'll have to add in more columns here and drag these formulas back. Similarly, if the customer's leases end after the end period that's displayed in the template, you'll have to include more rows here and drag the formulas across. In each of these data saving tabs, you can see that there's different sections. So we have this bit here, which will be pulling data that will save down to the system once we actually create our leases. There's a section here with white cells. This just contains the time periods during which lease payments will be taking place. This yellow section here will display any data that the system will be saving once you click Save Data. And this green section at the end shows all of the data that's already been saved against these leases. This will make more sense once we create the lease members and I show you how it works during the data saving. Okay, so we'll just go through now and check everything's been filled in for this lease that we're creating. So for this lease here, I've not entered a lease payment because it's been done in the variable payments tab. But for my second partially retrospective B lease, it's got regular payments. So I've put it as 200 and I'm using the copy autofill type. So when we go to create the lease later, this will automatically fill in 200 at each of the payment periods for the monthly lease. I've also chosen to make this a lease in arrears and this one in advance. But you'll notice even though this is a payment in arrears, the payment has been put in at the month where the lease starts, and then the logic will pick it up in arrears later on. Okay, so once you have all of your data in the source data sheet, you're ready to create the leases. To do that, you need to open up the IFI 002 Create Leases template. Okay, so we pick our category as actual. And refresh this workbook. Sorry, one thing to mention before I go around to creating the leases is that the lease parameters will need to be filled in for these. So in the actual category, I have filled in the central discount rate because my leases both use a central discount rate. So we see this begins on the 1st of February 2019, and this is 1st of January 2019. So for all leases, we need to make sure there's a discount rate loaded against this start date. And then also for partially retrospective A leases, we need to load a discount rate against this start date here under the IFRS 16 FR category. This is a reference category that stores data for partially retrospective A type leases. And you can notice here I've made the selection of the lease transition option. So I can show you here, if I select the IFRS 16 FR category, and refresh the workbook against the entity I'm creating my lease for, we can see that there are discount rates saved there, so it will pull those through later on when it's calculating and saving data. Sorry, that entity doesn't match. I'll just change that quickly. Right, so the next thing to do is to copy all of the data that's been put in this template here. And paste it into Create Leases. But here we'll paste it as values only. This is so that all of the validation checks can be run there in this template. If you paste it in completely and not as values, then the validation checks won't flag up any issues. So we can see that both of these leases are valid and it's automatically generated member IDs for the new leases. If there were any issues flagged up here, what you'd have to do is make the change both in this template and in this IFI 00 template as well. There is the option to add any initial startup costs and things here. You don't need to do that in the Create Leases template, and this will read through later in the mass upload. So we go back to our Create Leases template, and since there are no validation issues, we can add our new leases. So this is triggering a data manager package that's going to create our metadata and automatically upload transaction data for these two leases. But this is only possible in the NetWeaver system. It's slightly different in the Microsoft system. The upload has to be done manually, as well as creating the master data that needs to be done manually as well. But I'll go through the details of that in a later session. Okay, so both of our new leases should have been created. We'll just double check that in the lease ref dimension. Okay, there's our vehicle lease 1 and vehicle 1 and vehicle 2. So they've both been created and we can move on to the next step. So what we need to do now is take these automatically generated IDs from this template and copy and paste the IDs into the data preparation template against the corresponding leases. Now we can refresh our metadata. So what will happen is there's lots of formulas in the subsequent tabs that are referencing these lease IDs. So when we refresh the metadata, it will pick up all the properties we've just saved down using the Create Leases template. Okay, and now we refresh our workbook. Something worth mentioning before we continue is this discount rate table sheet. So it's important that when you're loading the leases initially, especially the partially retrospective B-type leases, that this category is actual before you refresh the workbook. Also worth noting is that these are the lease-specific flows where discount rates might be loaded against lease length. In the case that this flow property is being used to load discount rates, this will need updating based on what the customer has implemented in their solution, but I'll go through the details of that in the next session. Okay, so we selected our category as actual, the workbook's been refreshed. The next step is to load the lease, to save the data in each of these green and yellow tabs. So as you can see, it's pulling in these lease reference IDs and picking up the data for them. And then in the yellow section, we should see the data that will be saved. If I can find it. Yeah. Okay, so I'll push the Save Data button. So the bulk of this mass upload section is just cleaning the data and making sure all of the values are there and in the correct format. Once that's done, all it needs doing is the members creating and then all of this data saving down. Since I didn't enter any fixed percentage increases or fixed value increases, I can skip some of these tabs coming up later on, but we will need to save data on most of these tabs here. You can see that the lease payment value that's saved here is 0 and here it's 200. That's because for this lease we copied this value, we entered lease payment number and copied it across, whereas for this one it's picking it up from the variable payments tab. I didn't enter any service fee data, so we don't need to save this down, but we do need to save the discount percentages. So at the top here, highlighted in yellow, it's showing the accounts that this data is being saved against. So I didn't enter fixed percentage, fixed value increases, but I do need the total payment index. This data saving process can take quite a while, especially when you've got a lot of leases, which is why we don't recommend loading more than 150 at a time. Does anybody have any questions up to this point?
Nope. Something. Can you hear me?
Yeah, sorry, I can hear.
Sorry. Yeah, sorry. It's my computer's crashed. I thought you couldn't hear me.
I've got one actually.
Yep.
So every time you upload a bulk of the leases, you need to go through every single one of these tabs or all the relevant tabs and save the data.
Yeah, that's right. Every bulk load you do, you need to go through all of these because this is just pulling in the data that specifically corresponds to these lease IDs here.
Okay. Thanks.
No problem. And what we're going to have to do with the partially retrospective A leases, which I'll explain in more detail when we get to it, is go back through these tabs again, but save the retrospective data back down. So whereas before, when we created the leases, we then had to go and type in each of the payments in IFI 003, we don't need to do that here. The template's doing it all for you. This payment in arrears tab, it only needs to be saved down if you have any leases where the payments in arrears occur, which we do, so I'll save that down as well. Okay, I didn't enter any initial costs and incentives, so we won't have anything to save here. And this tab is not applicable right now. This is when we go back to save the fully retrospective data. Okay, so now that all of that has been saved down, we go back here. We take these, the ID for the partially retrospective A lease, and we copy that and paste it into this fully retrospective properties sheet and paste it as a value. And what it will do is fill out all of these properties based on what was saved when we created the lease in IFI 002. So these 6 properties are just specifically for the partially retrospective A leases. So we need to copy these property values and save it against this lease in the admin client. So if I go back into the admin client and find our lease, so it ended in 7. So it's this vehicle quarterly lease here. If I scroll across, we'll see the 6 properties are up here. And I can paste them in. And then just save and process the dimension. Okay, now we go back to our data preparation template and we refresh the metadata again. So what we're going through now is going to load the data, the retrospective data for our lease. So this category needs to be changed from actual to IFRS 16_FR, which is our reference category. And then you can see it's pulling in these categories that we've just filled in, these properties, sorry, that we've just filled in the admin client. Okay, and then we refresh our workbook again. And then what we'll have to do is go back through these green and yellow tabs and save them all down again. To reduce the number of leases that you're bulk loading into the system, you don't need to load those which aren't IFRS 16 applicable. So these are ones which end before the transition date, or these short-term leases like those that only last for 1 month. They don't need to be loaded. Okay, so I'll go to this lease payment number and you can see it's just saving data for this one now because this was our partially retrospective A lease. So I'll press save data. When you're loading new leases into a new customer system for IFRS 16, I'd recommend that you load a batch of test leases first and check that the output is as expected before loading a big batch. Are there any more questions? Okay. So this takes a while because it's looking through every period of the lease to see where the values are and then saving each of them down individually. We can skip those again. So a lot of the issues that come up with incorrect calculations tend to be related to the start dates or end dates being incorrect, or these payment and other lease-related information not being saved down correctly. So it's important to check that all of this has been done properly before you save it down. The good thing is you only have to go through this process once when you do your bulk upload, and then you don't have to click through all these tabs. You can just upload your leases using the usual process. So after this is done and we've saved data on all of the tabs that we need to, we'll open up a report called IFI 003A, which is like IFI 003, but the calculations are showing. So you can see whether or not the data has been saved correctly using this template. So this time we do need to save the IFRS 16 FR sheet down. And that's it. At this point, all of the lease data has been saved and the leases are all created. So now, if I just go back to the source data, we can see our lease IDs and names. And we can open up IFI 003A, so this doesn't have formulas. Okay. So we pick the actual category. This is our entity. Our leases. One of them started in January, the other started in February. So I'll start by checking the January lease. this was a monthly lease. So we click Refresh Workbook. And you can see all of the payment and discount rate information has been saved down. And this number in red is the sum of the present value payment. Okay, so that lease has been put in successfully, and then the next step would be, as usual, to run the calculation for the lease costs and then view the results in this report, and then to translate from lease currency into reporting and local currency. We went through the details of how to do this in the earlier session, so I won't repeat myself, but we'll go back and check that the second lease was loaded properly. So this started in February and it was a quarterly lease. And once again, we can see that the data here has been entered for our quarterly lease. Okay, so that's how you use the bulk upload template to save lease information into the IFRS 16 module. And like I say, the bulk of the time is spent preparing the data to get it into this format, and sometimes even between pasting it from IFI 000 into IFI 002, where the validation checks take place. It's just going back and forth and making sure everything is correct before the lease can be created. And then once that's complete, we make sure this is the correct category for what we're trying to achieve. So actual if we're saving actual data, and then IFRS 16 FR when we come back for that later on. Then we go through each of these green and yellow tabs and save them down. And for ones where you have no values entered, such as fixed percentage increase, you don't need to save these down. But for good practice, you can go through all of them, and if there is no data to save, it will tell you that. And then for fully retrospective leases, you copy the ID, you paste it in here, and then you take these property values and paste it into the admin client. And every time you make a change in the admin client, remember that when you return here, you need to refresh the metadata.